Greetings everyone. I'm going to take you through the process of installing Everlast Epoxy floor. I encourage you to familiarize yourself with these installation instructions before you begin, so you don't end up wasting money and time on redoing it. Note that the mixing and application instructions for Everlast Epoxy floor is different than the mixing and application instructions for Everlast cove, base, and wall. If you get these mixed up, or try to mix the floor using the cove instructions, or try to install the cove using the floor instructions, then your project will be unsuccessful. Also, if you attempt to modify any of the measurements in the mixing instructions that's on the labels, it will not work properly. This video applies to both our Everlast Epoxy floor and to our Eco floor. The overnight floor, however, has different mixing ratios, so you should still watch this video even if you are installing our overnight floor, as the rest of the procedures apply. But keep in mind that the mixing ratios are different, so please refer to the labels on the cans. There are 4 things to do before you begin. Number 1 is to study this video and also go over the documents provided on our how-to page. We recommend that you study the 40-page installation best practices and guide, then print the 11-page instructions and have them with you on the job site. We strongly recommend that no matter what your experience level is with other flooring materials or other epoxies, that you please watch this video in its entirety as well as study the PDF instructions. Number 2 is to be sure that you have all the necessary materials and tools. We'll go over that in more detail shortly. Number 3 is to be sure that you have properly prepared the substrate. Number 4 is to be sure that you have the right atmospheric conditions to install Everlast floor. I'll go over all these with you, then we'll get into the installation instructions. Let's first look at the primary material you'll need from us to install your Everlast floor with the cove. Everlast primer consists of 3 different materials: Everlast Cove Primer Part A and Everlast Cove Primer Part B. These are both resins, and fumed silica. This is a fine, white, powdery substance. Everlast Cove Base and Wall consists of 4 different materials: Everlast Cove Base and Wall Part A and Everlast Cove Base and Wall Part B. These are both resins, and Everlast mini fibers, and it also contains an 8x8 box of aggregate. Everlast floor consists of 3 different materials: Everlast Floor Part A and Everlast Floor Part B. These are both resins, and it also contains an 8x8 box of aggregate. Everlast Top Coat consists of 2 resins: Everlast Stay Clean Sealant Part A and Everlast Stay Clean Sealant Part B. And finally, anti-slip material to help make the floor slip-proof. The Cove Primer, Cove Base and Wall, and floor resins, and the top coat come in multiple size containers. Also, resins for Cove Primer, Cove Base and Wall, and floor are all different, so it is important that you keep resins separate and according to the product, as well as follow the mixing ratios that are printed on each label. Fumed silica and the mini fibers come packaged in a bag inside a cardboard box along with a measuring container. Depending on your project, there may be other material on your order, so when you receive an order from us, you'll need to go through it to familiarize yourself with what you have. It is better to do that right away than halfway through the project when you need something. Also, be sure to check that the shipment has everything on the packing list. We can't do anything about it unless you noted it on the freight bill if there was anything missing or damaged. This is the paperwork that the delivery driver gets signed at the time he drops off the freight. For each kit of floor and cove, you'll need 1 box of aggregate. So if you ordered 25 kits of floor and 5 kits of cove base and wall, you'll get a total of 30 8x8 boxes of aggregate. The aggregate is the same whether for floor or for cove base and wall. These aggregate boxes will be marked with the color and the dye lot. It is important that you use the same dye lot for a whole room. The dye lots represent the batches of each color of marble or quartz that was used, and color can vary from batch to batch. So if you run short and need to order some more to finish a project, let us know so we can try to send the same dye lot again. The next thing you do after you unload the truck is to store the material in a warm, dry place. We recommend heating a small room to 80 degrees to store the product, as it is hard to install Everlast floor when the materials are cold. It is recommended to organize and recheck your whole order before you store it to make sure you have everything you need. Let's talk about tools for your project. It is important that you use the proper tools. These are listed on our recommended tools section of our how-to webpage. For example, it says you need a 5-gallon bucket for every 5 kits. Don't deviate from these instructions by trying to use tools that are not recommended, like where it says to use a 9-amp mixing drill. Don't attempt to use a concrete mixer or an epoxy flooring power mixer. These mixers do not agitate the blend enough, and you will struggle with troweling it if you don't use the recommended mixing method. Be sure to get the recommended trowels, as if you attempt to use a cheap trowel, a bull float, or a pool trowel, or a gas-powered concrete power trowel, your end result will be undesirable. Always use safety chemical splash-resistant goggles when mixing resins, and use non-permeable gloves whenever handling material. We also recommend wearing a dust mask when mixing the fumed silica and mini fibers. Have plenty of denatured alcohol, a spray bottle, and rags on hand to keep your tools clean as you work. Sticky trowels are hard to use. Make sure to get separate containers for measuring and mixing A resins and B resins. It's helpful to mark these as such. Don't use the same container for different resins. Mark the lines you'll be filling up to. A trick that saves time and helps to avoid costly mistakes is to use a piece of tape and put the top of the tape at the line where the resin is to be poured to. It is easier to see when you are pouring than trying to find the right line while you're holding a heavy bucket. The third thing to do before you start is to be sure that your substrate is properly prepared. As you know, there are many different floor surfaces, such as concrete, wood floors, cement board, vinyl tile, asbestos glue, quarry and ceramic tile, and radiant heating systems, just to name a few. Every substrate requires a different method of preparation, so I'm not covering this in this video because they do not all apply to you. We have instructions for how to prepare each different substrate on our how-to webpage. I do want to stress the importance of properly preparing your substrate. Most floor failures are a result of poor preparation, so be sure to study the section for your substrate. Besides there being different substrates, there are other issues such as FRP wall panels, leftover adhesive residue from the prior flooring, and floor drains. Information on each of these is also provided on our how-to webpage. One thing that does apply to all substrates is to be sure to have an even surface to install Everlast Epoxy floor on, without any pits or low areas to fill in. Do not attempt to install Everlast Epoxy floor prior to patching the low spots. Attempting to fill low areas with a floor mixture at the same time you are installing the floor will result in, number one, a very inconsistent finish with resin puddles. Because Everlast floor is a resin-rich system, when it is applied thicker than 1/8 of an inch, what happens is the aggregate will settle and the resin will attempt to seek its own level, resulting in high spots appearing dry and the low spots appearing as a puddle. Installing over wavy, uneven concrete will result in the finished floor looking wavy. While the floor will be otherwise fine, do understand that your Everlast Epoxy floor will have a marbleized look, and you will see the humps and bumps in the concrete through the coating. Number two is loss of coverage. One kit of Everlast floor will yield 25 square feet per kit at 1/8 of an inch thick. Improper floor prep will result in excessive material usage. Everlast floor and/or Everlast cove basin wall can be used as a floor patch material, but it must be allowed to cure prior to installing the floor. Be sure to check the section about the substrate because some surfaces need to be primed with Everlast primer, and the information you need is provided there. Also, if you are installing a light color, you need to prime the substrate with our white primer, even if your substrate doesn't otherwise require a primer. This is so you don't have any see-through problems. The last thing to be aware of before you begin installing Everlast floor is the atmospheric conditions. The temperature is very important. Everlast floor typically is cured enough to apply top coat in 8 to 12 hours, provided the substrate temperature is above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. In cold weather conditions, it takes much longer to cure. Also, if the substrate is cold, it can take much longer to cure. If the substrate is less than 55 degrees Fahrenheit, then do not attempt to install Everlast floor. If the substrate is between 55 degrees Fahrenheit and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, it can take up to 3 days to cure and could remain sticky until top coated. Between 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, allow 1 extra day for curing. One more thing to check is that you don't have a cold draft coming in where the cove base is to be installed. or at any exterior doors near where the flooring is to be installed. This needs to be taken care of before you start, because a cold draft will cause the cove base to sag before it cures and will hinder the flooring from curing also. Other important atmospheric conditions such as hydrostatic pressure is addressed in detail in our floor prep guide. Cove base should be installed first before installing the floor. Before you start the cove base, be sure there are no gaps in the drywall. If there are gaps between the drywall and the floor, fill them in and wait for the filler to cure. The finished cove base should be about 3/16 of an inch thick, so if the wall where you plan to install cove base is recessed deeper than that, fill it in advance with wallboard, cement board, or plywood. Do not try to make the cove base thicker to fill in an area, as it will be heavy and could slump. Protect the wall finish with blue painter's tape. Begin by priming the surface and then wait for an hour to allow the primer to become tacky. Apply the cove base with a gauge trowel. Leave a little excess at the bottom to form the cove. Then finish it with a cove tool to create a smooth, even finish. After removing the tape, use the gauge trowel to smooth the top edge to ensure that it is smooth. I'm going to walk you through each step. 1. First, make a batch of cove primer. Pour cove primer part A and cove primer part B together according to the mixing ratios on the labels into a measuring container and mix for 30 seconds. Number 2. Then you add the fumed silica, also according to the mixing ratios on the label, to the blend and mix for approximately 90 seconds. Number 3. Prime a section of the prepared wall surface with this batch. This is best done with a 4-inch paint roller. Only enough primer to wet the wall is needed. If you have multiple kits of cove base and wall to do, then prime all the area that gets cove base and wall. The primer needs to be tacky before you start installing cove base. This usually takes an hour and sometimes much longer in cold or humid conditions. Once the primer is tacky, you can start installing your cove base. Just feel the wall first to be sure it is tacky, like a sticky fly trap. Once the primer is tacky, you have about 4 hours or so to work with until the primer cures and is no longer tacky. Once the primer isn't tacky anymore, then you need to reprime. But 4 hours is plenty time to install 6 kits of cove base. Next, you'll make your cove base material. We suggest dry mixing the aggregate before blending it in with the resins and mini fibers mixture. Pour cove base and wall part A and cove base and wall part B together according to the mixing ratios on the labels into a 5-gallon bucket and mix for 30 seconds. Then add the mini fibers according to the mixing ratios on the labels to the blend and mix for approximately 90 seconds. Add a whole box of aggregate to the blend and mix until it is fully blended, about 60 seconds. It is best to gradually pour the aggregate much the way you do concrete. Next, you apply the cove base to the wall with a trowel. Form the cove and smooth out the base with a cove trowel. Cove base can also be formed using a gauge trowel and a large dinner spoon. You have about 45 minutes to work with each kit of cove base. After that, it starts gelling and gets harder to use. Do not put on the cove thicker than 3/16 of an inch. It will be too heavy to stay on the wall and will fall off like an avalanche. Keeping your tools clean and damp with denatured alcohol is key here, as sticky tools are not your friend. Leave a clean straight line to butt the floor up to. You want to leave the cove radius intact. Clean away the excess cove material and cut out a straight line just past the cove. After forming the cove base, remove the blue painter's tape with a slow upward pull. Remove the tape after each kit or the epoxy will harden and the tape will become more difficult to remove. Now take your gauge trowel and clean up the top edge to get a nice even finish. Also, even out any ridges that the cove trowel left. Make sure to remove any excess material on the floor so you won't have to scrape it up later. It is best, but not necessary, to wait till the next day before installing the floor. That way the cove base is hard and won't get damaged if you happen to knock into it with a light cord or a floor finish trowel. You can also put the cove base material around pipes or other protrusions in the floor. Clean up the floor afterwards so you have a clean floor to install Everlast Epoxy floor on. Just don't use your favorite broom because the epoxy will ruin it. After the cove is hard, be sure to scrape up any excess out on the floor. Otherwise, you'll have to fight the chunks while you're trying to trowel the floor. Because this was a plywood floor, we primed it and taped the joints before application. But be sure to see our floor prep guidelines for your particular floor. We suggest you use duct tape at the termination of the floor. You'll remove this just as soon as you're done troweling. Don't leave it here overnight. Mark out a 25 square foot space for your first couple kits, so you can get accustomed to how thick to apply the floor. If you put it on too thick, the finished product will have shiny spots in the areas that are too thick. Remember, each kit should cover 25 square feet. Make sure to have a halogen light next to you while you trowel, even if the room has good lighting already. When preparing to blend the floor, we recommend dumping each full box of aggregate into a bucket because it's easier to pour the aggregate from a 5-gallon bucket into the resin. Remember to dry mix the aggregate before adding to the resin. Also, 1 full box of aggregate per kit. Now for the floor mix. Pour Everlast Floor Part A and Everlast Floor Part B together, according to the mix ratios on the labels, into a 5-gallon bucket and mix for 1 minute. Add 1 box of aggregate to the blend and mix for 1 to 2 minutes. It is best to gradually pour the aggregate much the way you do concrete. Use a clean bucket after each break or after every 5 kits. Otherwise, the odor of epoxy left over in the bucket from the previous mixes will cause the new epoxy to heat up and gel too fast. Always begin each kit with clean tools and have solvent on hand to keep your trowels clean as you work. After mixing the floor, pour out the entire bucket in a line along the floor. Don't just pour a little at a time, as it will harden in the bucket. Do not allow a mixed kit to sit unused for any length of time. Whoever is mixing needs to hold off on making each next kit till the prior batch is troweled. Don't let the person mixing pour the 2 resins together while they wait, because as soon as the 2 resins are poured together, the mix begins the process of heating up and gelling. The kit needs to be poured out right away and spread out with a trowel as soon as it's poured. Then, after it's spread out, go back and do the necessary finish troweling. Not following this procedure and allowing the material to begin gelling in the bucket or in a pile on the floor will result in loss of coverage and make it hard to trowel. In other words, it will cost you time and money. Once you get it spread out on the floor to cover your 25 square feet, you have at least an hour in which it's still pliable to work with. Right now, he's spreading out the whole kit with a finish trowel. You should get about 25 square feet per kit. Spread it to a thickness of 1/8 of an inch. Use the aggregate as your gauge and spread it to the thickness of the largest aggregate. If you go thicker than 1/8 of an inch, you'll get less than 25 square feet per kit, and the finished floor will look like it has puddles. These puddles won't be noticeable today while you are troweling, but tonight the aggregate will settle into the low spots, as the resin will attempt to seek out its own level. And tomorrow you'll see spots that look like shiny puddles where the low areas in the substrate once were. So it is important to spread it to 25 square feet per kit. If the material sits on the floor for any length of time, you need to mix it up before spreading it. Make sure to pick out any oversized rocks or trash that got left on the floor. Remember, it is important to keep your tools clean as you work. I like to clean them again after spreading the floor just before I do the finish troweling. Remember to keep your halogen light directly on the floor with you, pointing to the area you are troweling. This helps to see the ridges, high or low spots, trowel marks, and imperfections so that you can work them out. Everlast floor is not self-leveling, so how you leave it is how it's going to look when it's finished. Use the gauge trowel on the edges next to the cove. Finally, go over the section again with your finished trowel to smooth it out and make it nice and uniform. Long, even multiple strokes will provide the best results. Occasionally, you will need to add some material to a low spot to fill it in. Remember to pay special attention to the seams between each new bucket of epoxy that you trowel on. After you're finished with each kit, look over it with a halogen light to be sure it looks nice and the aggregate is tight. Add more to the areas where the marble looks like it's not tight or not touching each other, and be sure there are no trowel marks. You can add more material to just where you need it with a gauge trowel, then work it over again with a finish trowel. Again, be sure not to leave behind any trowel marks. If you're not able to do the entire floor in one day, you need to create a transition. Make a straight line with duct tape, preferably at a doorway, as you will always see a line in the finished floor when you stop and start the next day. Trowel the floor up to the duct tape. Be sure to remove the duct tape as soon as you're done troweling. 24 hours after you install your floor, the top coat can usually be applied. In cold weather conditions, 65 degrees or under, the floor could take much longer to dry. Always check the floor before walking on it to make sure it is dry, otherwise you risk pulling out chunks of it with your shoes. Remove stray aggregate that are sticking up out of the floor with a scraper. The stray aggregate is usually minimal, just make sure there are no sharp rocks protruding out of the floor. Also, pay close attention to the cove base, as sometimes the top edge is sharp. Go over all the cove base with a rub rock to smooth it out and remove any rough spots. Remove ridges and trowel marks on the floor with a rub rock. For larger projects, use an industrial floor sander like the one in the video. Now for the finishing touches. When mixing the top coat, never mix more than you can use in 7 minutes. If you need to, split your top coat into smaller amounts. For mixing, mix 2 parts Everlast Stay Clean Sealant Part A with 1 part Everlast Stay Clean Sealant Part B. It's a 2-to-1 mixing ratio. Use a 3 or 4 inch roller to coat the cove base. After the cove base is done, make another batch of top coat for the floor. Pour it out in a line across the floor. Next, use a squeegee to spread the top coat across the floor. Make sure you broadcast the non-slip evenly into the sealed floor by hand, by flicking it into the air so it fans out and falls to the floor. This guy is showing you the wrong way to do it. This way won't spread it evenly. The correct way is to flick it into the air and let it fan out as it falls down. You do not need to use too much non-slip. 1 quart can cover up to 1,500 square feet of floors. The non-slip is measured by hand, so use as much as needed to obtain the desired texture. Then, using a 1/4 inch nap roller, back roll the floor. When applying the top coat, we suggest that you wear spiked shoes. This will allow you to work on the floor without damaging the top coat. If you do not have spiked shoes, then we suggest that you wear white-soled shoes, as black soles can mark up the floor when they get wet with sealant or solvents. Some people even put duct tape on the bottom of their shoes to prevent them from damaging the new floor while sealing the floor. I hope you have found this video helpful. Be sure to check out the resources on www.everlastepoxy.com/how-to for more information.